Hi, I'm Alan Rose. Welcome to the first WordFest on Zoom for 2021. We thought this year would never get here, did we? The pandemic forced us to suspend our monthly in-person WordFest gatherings, but going to Zoom also allowed us to move around Southwest Washington. And tonight, we're going to the foothills of the Lewis River Valley in Clark County, then down to Cathlamet in Wahkiakum County, and then back to Longview in Cowlitz County. So now it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first presenter tonight, an outstanding writer, an enthusiastic promoter of our literary community, and just an all-around wonderful human being, Alan Rose. Hey, welcome to WordFest. Thanks, it's great being here. I love WordFest. I never miss a program. Well, that's good to hear, and congratulations. Your newest novel, As If Death Summoned, has just been published. Tell us about it. It's about the AIDS epidemic, and Amble Press, an imprint of Bywater Books, released it on World AIDS Day, December 1st, 2020, right in time for the 40th anniversary of the epidemic. It was 1981 when what we now call AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, started appearing in the United States. The story is set primarily in Portland, Oregon. Yes, the book takes place over one night in a hospital waiting room in 1995, where the narrator is keeping a vigil for a friend who is in the ICU. As he maintains this vigil, there are a series of flashbacks of the narrator's experience of the epidemic. The narrator is alone, as he says, just me and several dozen ghosts. As the story unfolds, one of the questions is which friend is in the ICU? Though I got the sense that this vigil the narrator is keeping is for himself as well. That's very astute and I think accurate, for at this point, he's burnt out after working on the front lines of the epidemic for the past 10 years. Although he himself is not infected, he counts himself among the living dead. The narrator lived in Melbourne, Australia for 10 years with his partner, Gray, who is deceased when the book opens. After Gray's death, the narrator returns home to Portland and works at a community AIDS organization. I noticed you never named the narrator. That was intentional. The narrator is symbolic. He's like the unknown soldier in wars, representing all the stories that were never told. And there were many. By the time the story takes place in 1995, more than 300,000 Americans had already died of AIDS, most of them gay men. Forward reviews called your novel, I quote, as heartwarming and hope-giving as it is heartbreaking. I was pleased to read that the reviewer found it heartwarming and hope-giving as well as heartbreaking, because I feared that people would think, oh, an AIDS novel must be a real downer. But I think it's very life-affirming. I expected the heartbreak. I was surprised at the humor. I included a lot of humor because there was a lot of humor amid the grief and loss, undying humor in the face of death. And I wanted to reflect that humor, that incredibly brave humor in the book. Some of the flashbacks take place in Australia, especially on the Bogong High Plains of Victoria. What is their significance? The Bogong High Plains is a vast plateau in northern Victoria, about 150 miles north of Melbourne. At 6,000 feet, they were sacred to the Aboriginal people of Australia. They become a kind of additional character in the novel, representing the mystical, the mysterious, the sacred in human existence, which Gray is keenly sensitive to, while the narrator is more of a rational skeptic. There's a sub-theme winding through your book about an actual event in Australian history called the Mount Bogong Tragedy. Tell us about that. In 1936, 3 skiers attempted to cross the high plains in winter. They were caught in a blizzard that lasted a week. 2 survived the ordeal, but one of the men, Cleve Cole, died. In the book, his spirit continues to wander lost over the high plains, and the narrator comes to identify with Cleve Cole that he too is lost in a kind of blizzard, unable to find his way out, that he too is dying in the blizzard of the AIDS epidemic. You have an early chapter where you introduce Gray, the narrator's deceased partner, and the Bogong High Plains. Would you read that? Sure. I just happen to have a copy of the book with me. The Bogong High Plains held some mystical affinity for Gray. They evoked in him a deep sense of the holy he found nowhere else. It was on these plains he felt his own spiritual connection to the earth. It was here he entered the dream time. The two of us sat next to the campfire, he staring into the flames as I read my book. He'd always enjoyed campfires. The flickering, dancing, waving lights beckoned him, producing mild trance states where his imagination and memories wandered hand in hand. Although he had become a barrister like his father and grandfather, at heart, Gray was a romantic. To the Aboriginal peoples, these plains were sacred. The statement came out of nowhere, apropos of nothing but his flame-lit reveries. I looked up from my book. To the Aboriginal peoples, the entire earth was sacred, I reminded him. They dwelled in a sacred universe. Yes, I know, but some places are special, he insisted. What, like they're sacreder? Some places remind us that everything is sacred. This affinity related to an experience he'd had as a young boy. Each summer, he and his brothers accompanied their father camping on this vast plateau in northern Victoria. His father said it was how he got away, far from the madding crowd. Your mother didn't go along? I'd asked. Mother was the madding crowd. Besides, she detested camping, considered anything beyond Melbourne city limits the outback and not fit for human habitation. Gray and I would go up there several times a year, staying at a favorite secluded camping spot from which we hiked and backpacked in spring and early summer and skied cross country in winter. I didn't share his attraction to the high plains. To me, they were bleak, barren, and unwelcoming, a vast empty landscape, 50% heath and scrub brush, 25% grasslands, scraggly trees here and there, the rest rocky outcroppings. I found them scruffy and desolate. I've always preferred mountains, admittedly not abundant in Australia, and put our difference in landscape preferences down to my growing up in the Pacific Northwest, with the Cascade Peaks always in view. Gray thought it had more to do with our sun signs. You're Capricorn, he'd say, Earth sign, the goat. So yeah, you're drawn to mountains. I'm Aquarius. What's Aquarius drawn to? Scrubrush? Air sign. And he'd raise his hands and eyes overhead. Sky, infinitude, the eternal. He'd been brought up in the Anglican church, so he was not particularly religious. The high church tradition offered pomp and pageantry and exquisite liturgical music. But as to the human history and the mystical, Gray turned to what he called his Aboriginal roots, the land. He was staring again into the fire. Maybe the indigenous people didn't express it conceptually like we do, but they sensed it. I sense it. Sense what? These plains are haunted. By then, I'd heard the folklore that Cleve Cole's restless spirit wandered this land. You mean haunted as in ghosts? I asked. I mean haunted as in holy. Every people in every place in every period of human history have believed that certain locations, mountains and volcanoes, deserts, forests, springs, and watering holes were repositories of special energies holding special powers. I remain a skeptic on the subject, intrigued, intellectually curious, but skeptical. Gray, however, was a believer. Though questioning, even cynical about so much else, politics, the law, his mother's artificially youthful appearance, He was a believer in the sacredness of these plains. "This is where I want my ashes spread," he said on that occasion. "This is where I belong." He'd just been diagnosed that week with AIDS, and hearing his words unnerved me. "We've got plenty of time to talk about that," I said. And without commenting further, I returned to my book, and he returned to his fire reveries. It turned out we had less time than we thought. It was several weeks after arriving back in the States that I began to have recurring dreams of the Bogong High Plains. Dreams figure importantly in the story. The book plays with the reader, asking amid the dreams, into the imagination and memories of the narrator, what's real and what's not. Yes, in fact, the book opens with the famous fable of Zhuangzi. Of course, the famous fable of Zhuangzi. Remind us again? Zhuangzi was a great philosopher who lived in 4th century China before the Christian era. The fable goes, there once was a Chinese philosopher who dreamt he was a butterfly. The dream was so real that he wondered whether it had been a dream, or was he a butterfly, now dreaming he was a Chinese philosopher. It's how I open the book, and I use it again about midway, where Gray and the narrator are having a conversation on the Bogong High Plains about the nature of reality and what's real. Would you read that for us? Sure. Gray and the narrator are sitting around the campfire eating their evening meal. Also, throughout the book, they have this ongoing game between themselves where one quotes a piece of poetry and the other tries guessing the poet. "Once upon a time, Gray told me a fable. It was autumn, the land sere and dry, the evening quickly chilling as we had our evening meal next to the campfire. It went like this. There once was a Chinese philosopher." "Which part of China?" "What? China's a big place. Which province did he come from?" "It's a fable. Does that matter? I like to know these things." "He was from Hangzhou. You made that up. Anyway, there once was this Chinese philosopher. Any particular school?" "What do you mean, particular school?" "Ancient China had a number of different schools of thought. Confucianism, Taoism, Chan Buddhism. He had an online degree." "Oh, one of those schools." "So this Chinese philosopher, he once dreamt that he was a butterfly. And no, I don't know what kind of butterfly." "Too bad. It would have added authenticity to the story." "Okay, he dreamt he was a monarch butterfly." "I didn't know they had monarch butterflies in China." "The butterfly was visiting, so he wasn't a real Chinese butterfly." "No, but the philosopher was a real Chinese philosopher with a wonky degree." "Do you want to hear this fable or not?" "All ears. Shoot." "So this Chinese philosopher with a wonky degree from Hangzhou dreamt he was a monarch butterfly visiting China on a tourist visa." I appreciate the details. They make the story more interesting. I realize you're a concrete thinker. "The dream was so real," must have been at the REM stage of sleep. "The dream was so real, and this is the important part, he couldn't tell whether he was a Chinese philosopher who dreamt he was a butterfly, or was actually a butterfly, now dreaming he was a Chinese philosopher." Gray exhaled. He seemed relieved the telling was finished. "That's it? That's the whole fable?" He shook his head. "I'm sorry I bothered," and resumed eating. "No, it was okay, though it didn't have much of a narrative arc. And the character of the Chinese philosopher was kind of one-dimensional. He could have been developed a bit more, just past the tobacco sauce. Here, so what's the point of the fable?" "The point?" Gray put down the bottle and recited, "All that we see and seem is a dream within a dream." Edgar Allan Poe, really deep. And I recited back, "Something unknown is doing we don't know what." He creased his brow. "Who said that?" "Sir Arthur Eddington. His explanation for how the universe works." Eddington was a poet, physicist. All physicists are poets. They just use mathematics instead of words. I call foul. Gray handed back the Tabasco sauce. The fable suggests we can never be sure of who we are. Well, at least I'm sure I'm not a butterfly. Pretty sure. Philosophers have been trying to answer that question for thousands of years. Whether we're really butterflies? No. What's real? Descartes set out to doubt everything he could, to take nothing for granted until he found that which he could not doubt. Descartes, he that I think therefore I am guy? Right, cogito ergo sum. He eliminated everything down to the one thing he couldn't doubt, that he was thinking. And if he was thinking, then he must be real. But he assumed he was thinking. Huh? I'm saying maybe he stopped doubting a step too soon. He could have been hallucinating or merely dreaming that he was thinking. Gray considered this. Okay, but either way, it's still proof that he exists. What? I hallucinate, therefore I am? Doesn't seem as persuasive an argument. The question is, how do you really know what's real? Whether you're a philosopher dreaming he's a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he's a philosopher. Are those the only two choices? For the purposes of this discussion, yes. Then I'd rather be a philosopher with tenure. He sighed. I think we're losing the point here. Remind me again. That we can't ultimately know what's real. This, right now, could all simply be a dream. I'm dreaming. But if you're in the dream, how would you ever know whether it's a dream? Gray erupted in excitement. Exactly. That's the whole point. Brilliant. I stared at him. I think I missed the brilliant point I just made. That we can't tell whether we're really dreaming or not. This may all be a dream I'm having, and you're just part of it. You're suggesting I'm not real? That I'm part of your dream? Could be. He looked at me expectantly. Great. If this is your dream, you do the dishes, and I'll dream I'm reading a book. With a grim smile, he leaned over, kissed me on the cheek, and took my empty plate. Look, I'll do the dishes. You are so lucky to have me. I know, though it may only be a dream. Read your book. What's strange is that now, years later, my time in Australia does seem more like a dream than a memory. A dream where I was lucky to have Gray. Well, good luck with the book. You're having a book signing event this Saturday, January 16th, at the Merc in downtown Longview from 1 to 4 p.m. Yes, properly masked, socially distanced. People can come anytime between 1 and 4. Paperbacks galore. We'll have copies of the book for sale at a discount of $17, and I will autograph them. And for people who have already bought a copy, they can bring them to the Merc for me to sign. Well, it was great talking with you. Likewise, I feel we have a lot in common. Thanks for inviting me. I wish to thank my colleagues, Director Vicki Carter and Editor Bethany Glenn, for their extra efforts on that interview. Next, we're going to Cathlamet in Wahkiakum County and Dale Olson. Dale is a short story writer and poet, and she will be reading a short story that appeared in the Seaside Library's 2019 short story anthology. It's a story of our time titled What Sets Us Free.
Good evening, I'm Dale Olson, and I'm very happy to be here this evening with all of you at WordFest, one of my favorite literary events that Alan Rose hosts here in Longview and in the Lower Columbia. Tonight I'm going to be reading a short story that I wrote shortly after I moved to the Lower Columbia, living in Cathlamet, Washington. The story is called What Sets Us Free. And I wrote this for a short story competition that was hosted by Seaside Libraries for their short story anthology contest, which is an annual event, which I encourage all of you writers to seek out, because it's a really worthwhile and worthy event, because it does raise funds for Seaside Libraries and children's reading programs. So this is again called What Sets Us Free? Daria sat on the crowded bench of the concrete holding cell facing a 4-foot-high wall intended to provide privacy for women using the bathroom, keeping her dark eyes lowered while a middle-aged woman with a shiny face and missing teeth sat on the toilet. The air smelled of sweat, garlic, overripe cheese, urine, and tobacco. Daria glanced at the cell door where 2 immigration officers stood outside, chatting and occasionally laughing, while they waited for paperwork to be signed. Their faces looked young and confident, untroubled by the task of escorting non-American citizens through a confusing, broken system toward uncertain and sometimes dangerous futures. The agent with black, neatly combed hair and an easy grin reminded her of her brother. When the agent looked at her, Daria turned her face away and closed her eyes, replaying the day's bitter events in her mind. The morning had begun with familiar, everyday rhythms, the barely noticed rituals which can be mistaken for routine: tea, bread, and fig jam, a book propped up on the breakfast table, a rumpled gray cat napping under her chair. Her university roommates had already left for class. Daria was enjoying the English translation of a novel by Orhan Pamuk, but the English to Farsi dictionary was always within reach. Back in Tehran, her parents had encouraged her love of books, but not so much the independent thinking the books seemed to foster in Daria. She had lingered over Pamuk's story about Istanbul that morning without apprehension, without any premonition that life was about to change. Then there was a knock at the apartment door. Daria had opened the door to 2 Immigration Customs Enforcement agents standing on the welcome mat, holding paperwork which authorized them to take her to a federal holding facility while a court determined if she could stay in the US or if she would be returned home. Because of misdelivered documents which never reached her and an email address entered incorrectly by a government official, Daria was no longer in the US legally. Her student visa had expired. The lapsed document could not be fixed in a sensible or reasonable manner, but instead required armed ICE agents to pluck Daria from her happy life of academic studies and thrust her into a detention facility. This churning memory was interrupted by a female guard unlocking the cell door, bringing Daria's attention back to her present circumstances. The guard scanned the women's faces, shouting Daria's last name, mispronouncing it. The 3rd time the guard bellowed, "Nayeri," followed by several numbers. The Latina on Daria's left nudged her in the ribs and said, "That's you." As Daria approached the door, the immigration officer with the black hair stepped in and pointed at Daria's wrist. His smile was gone, and he was all business as he asked Daria for her alien registration number. Daria held out her arm, not knowing what it was she was being asked to provide. "This is your A number," he said, tapping her wristband. "Soon you'll know it by heart. That tells us who you are. 8 digits, remember it. I'm Officer Esteban. I'm in charge of your case. Follow me." Esteban led Daria to the intake area where she was given her housing assignment, a bin with bedding and toiletries and a handbook containing facility rules. Last of all, she was handed a yellow uniform, which she put on in the bathroom, then gave her personal clothing to a waiting guard. Her small pile of belongings looked pitiful and abandoned on the stainless steel countertop. A faded blue t-shirt, flannel pajama pants with monkeys on them, Vans, a black sweatshirt, rainbow socks, her telephone and charger, a leather wallet made by a friend, the Orhan Pamuk book with its university bookstore receipt stuck between the pages to mark her place. The guard doing the inventory looked squarely at Daria and said, "Where are your underthings?" Daria felt anger boil inside her at this latest indignity and crossed her arms over her chest and said nothing, staring defiantly at the guard. Daria was led back to the change-out room and was instructed to remove her underclothes and put on the facility-issued bra and panties. Before this day, Daria could not have imagined how bereft she would feel to unhook her own cotton bra and step out of her own underwear, handing these seemingly unimportant remnants of her life over to a stranger, as if she were leaving vital parts of herself behind. Daily patterns shape and root each of us, seeing or touching the faces of those who know us best, the inexpressible joy of walking under leafy trees and feeling sunshine and raindrops, marveling at the profusion of stars on a clear night, holding someone's hand, the songs of thrushes and meadowlarks, the taste of honey, the soft pillow as you fall asleep. When all that is familiar and loved is suddenly banished in one arbitrary stroke, it is as if an emergency surgery has occurred and a limb has been amputated without your consultation or consent. And now you are expected to adjust and go on as if you're okay, but you are not okay. This was how Daria felt, knowing she had an immigration court hearing in a month, that her parents had hired an attorney for her, that her university roommates were caring for her cat, and that her school advisor was advocating for her so she wouldn't get kicked out of the university. None of it lessened the trauma or lifted the black fog that enveloped her existence. For that first week, Daria stayed in her bunk in her assigned dorm and slept for long stretches. She tried to eat at least one meal a day, but it didn't seem to matter which meal of the day she chose. Pinto beans were always on the tray. Her period started on the 9th day of captivity, forcing Daria to get out of bed more frequently, stopping at the dorm officer's desk on the way to the lavatory to ask for supplies. Her yellow uniform was soiled 2 days in a row, so she had to request an extra set of clothes, plus clean bedding. Her bunkmates were sympathetic. At least the 2 Mexican girls were. The Chinese woman kept mostly to herself and didn't have much English, so Daria left her alone. The Mexican girls passed time knitting baby booties or folding candy wrappers into swans and flowers. Daria finally asked one of them, "Where do you get candy wrappers?" And the girl showed her how to use an electronic tablet to order candy from the commissary. Daria really wasn't interested in candy, but her curiosity was beginning to awaken from its 2-week slumber. The girl also pointed to a function on the tablet which allowed the user to communicate requests to facility staff. Daria studied the categories on the tablet screen: movie request, religious request, recreation request, menu request. Near the bottom of the screen, book request. Daria had seen worn paperback books on a bookcase near the dorm officer's desk and had browsed with indifference as she waited for sanitary pads. Most of the titles were in English or Spanish, and there was nothing that appealed to her, mostly romances and suspense thrillers. However, the tablet's book request button gave her a small feeling of hope. So she completed the electronic form, noting her native language as Farsi, English as secondary, with interest in literature by authors from Iran, Turkey, Sweden, France, Brazil. Daria pressed the send button and hoped she wouldn't end up with a Jane Austen novel. The next day, Daria was summoned to the dorm officer's desk. "Here, this came for you," and the officer handed Daria a bundle from library staff with a slip of paper wrapped around it. Daria took the package back to her bunk and read the outer wrapper. It said, "Miss Nairi, here are 2 books for you to borrow, plus a Farsi English dictionary. The enclosed novels are by a highly acclaimed Turkish author who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. I hope you enjoy these books." Daria removed the wrapper, and there in her lap was not 1, but 2 books by Orhan Pamuk. the author she had been reading before her world was upended, and a dictionary in her own language. In that moment, it felt as if a ray of light pierced Daria's despair, shining warm and unwavering to the core of her being. She lay there on the bunk, opened the first book, turned page after page, letting the beautiful language wash over her. And as she read, her mind floated to another land, another life, another story where, at least for a little while, Daria was free.
Dale, your face lit up with a beautiful smile when Daria finds the books. Can you tell us the story behind the story?
Just for a little background on this story, What Sets Us Free, I wrote this story after leaving a job which I was in for 12 years at an immigration detention facility. I worked in an administrative office, and the thing that made it possible for me to stay in that job, which was, I felt very conflicted working there. It was very hard to see the toll that the captivity took on people who were separated from their families and their friends. But the thing that I instigated to make my job bearable, which was just a secretarial job, was I made a proposal to the warden of the facility during my last 2 years there to run the book program for the detainees in the facility, because I had kind of become more and more aware of how limited the detainees' choices were for reading materials, that really most of the books that they had access to that they could check out from the facility library, they were mostly in English or Spanish. And the population did have a large number of Spanish speaking and reading people, but it also had people from all over the world with many other languages. And I just, I felt that those people were being neglected in having choices for reading materials. And being stuck in a facility like that, one of the worst things about it, I think, for people, besides the uncertainty and the separation from the people who love them, is the boredom, the many, many hours that they just have to find a way to pass in a, way that doesn't, make them go crazy. And so the warden had a lot of faith in me. He felt like my proposal was had merit, and he said, well, it couldn't be any worse than what we have now, which is not exactly an endorsement. But anyway, he gave me the chance to run the book program, and I dove into it with just more enthusiasm than probably anything I've ever endeavored to do other than raising children. And I took so much joy in finding books and ordering them that were in other languages, in Chinese and Turkish and Arabic. Some languages are very difficult to find literature in. Russian literature. There was a group of Russian detainees that they just got all fired up about getting a Russian copy of War and Peace, and they almost had like their own little book club where they were sharing their one Russian copy of War and Peace between about 5 of them. And the joy and the hope that I saw from those detainees who really loved reading, I saw that those books gave them a sense of freedom, and it turned their imaginations free, and I think made for some of them made the time bearable. And some of them would even write to me and say, this book that you got for me made all the difference while I was here. And so I know that program had a lot of meaning for people that were stuck there and had really nothing else to do besides watch TV. So that is why this story means a lot to me, is because Daria represents one detainee that I believe was really impacted in a very positive way by the book program that I helped develop.
Our thanks to Dale. And now we go to Longview and Mary Lyons. Mary is an essayist and poet. She is very popular at WordFest for her often humorous stories. Tonight, she is reading one of them titled Joy to the World, but not the world you're thinking of.
This piece is entitled Joy to the World, and world is spelled W-H-I-R-L-E-D, world. I don't know about you, but 2020 was a rough year for me. With all the upheaval from the pandemic and the election and the financial uncertainty, I was worn out by December. Christmas seemed like a mountain that I had to climb, and I very uncharacteristically acted impulsively when I saw a fun-looking item online that brought my 2 grandsons to mind. And I promptly ordered a trio of the items without hesitation, 3 flying baby Yodas. There they were in the online commercial, flying gently through the room while the children guided them by simply holding up their hands, and the baby Yodas would electronically sense the obstacle, a hand or the wall, and turn away in another direction. I thought, what fun! And I threw all caution to the wind and clicked away. I was going to get one for each of the 2 of them. Jonah was 12 and Asher was 5. But then I realized there's often a friend around, so I got 3. 3 flying baby Yodas were on their way, and I was proud of myself for choosing such a fun-filled gift that I imagined would deliver many hours of laughter and joy for the family. I tracked the shipment of baby Yodas online. I was eagerly waiting to see if I'd made the right decision in trusting a company whose name I'd never heard before. 10 days later, I returned home from a grocery store pickup, pandemic, to find a package waiting on the front porch. The Yodas had arrived. I took the brown box inside and opened it up on the dining room table, while my 2 cats, Charlie and Thundercat, wove themselves curiously around my ankles. They do that often, Charlie and Thundercat, most commonly when I'm in an especially precarious situation, like carrying large, fragile items across a darkened room. My cats are teaching me to survive with patience in a pandemic, and I've devised imaginative resolutions to some of our more contentious challenges, like locking my bedroom door before I go to bed in order to get any sleep past 6 a.m. We routinely alternated between quiet cat naps on my lap or quickly retrieved squirt bottles to nail them when they try and jump up on a table of food when I'm not looking. Well, they were simply making me aware of their presence at the moment as I opened up the box, and there were the Yodas. They were surprisingly small, well, very little actually, almost minuscule in the category of boy toys. Each was packaged separately in a stiff plastic shell, the kind that are almost impossible to open without a machete. Their teeny tiny wrinkled Yoda faces stared out at me with expressions that didn't seem especially cute, but this was Yoda. Out of the top of their heads was a black stick poking straight up, and loosely attached to the stick with tiny metal rings were 4 small, thin propeller blades hanging down limply to the side. The propeller blades were so loosely attached that they slid around and rattled inside the package when shaken. I was concerned. Loose propeller blades didn't seem like a good omen, and as I looked and shook the box, trying to see if there were any visible broken parts that had come loose in shipping, I tried to reassure myself that all was well and there was nothing to worry about. They'd probably extend out with centrifugal force when the propeller was activated, right? But I also wanted to know if I needed to have any batteries available for these characters on Christmas morning. The boxes didn't say. The boxes contained chargers for the rechargeable batteries contained inside the globe-shaped base that the little wrinkly heads were perched on, but I didn't want to be surprised and end up spending 20 minutes on Christmas morning rummaging through my daughter's kitchen drawer looking for 6 appropriate batteries. But I didn't want to risk damaging the packaging if I tried to open just one up and test it either. I decided to sleep on it, so I put them on the Christmas shelf in the closet for consideration on another day. Well, it took me one morning to decide, for the good of the family, to open up just one of those boxes and see if I had any problems making these characters work. I was able to pry open a package and read the directions contained inside. No batteries needed. Yay! But what about those loose, limp propeller blades? Shouldn't I test those just to be sure? Well, since they operated on a rechargeable battery, I had to plug the first little fellow in for what the directions promised would only be a few hours. I set a timer and got busy on other tasks I needed to do around the house. And when the ding of the timer bell went off, I was ready. Wrinkly-faced Yoda, wearing what looked like a long collection of limp plastic dreadlocks, stared back at me from the palm of my hand. I reached under his orb-like body and turned on the also small black switch to power him on. I don't remember now exactly what I expected. I think I hoped for a soft whirring sound as the propellers gently lifted him from the palm of my hand and sent him off a few feet as he waited for me to direct him. Well, instead, what erupted from him was a high-pitched, shrill whirring sound as the propellers immediately engaged and began spinning madly before my face. I instinctively reacted by gripping the round orb in my hand tighter while I frantically reached underneath and turned him off. Good grief, what had I embarked upon? I sort of sat there, stunned by what had just happened. But as I gathered my thoughts, I looked around the room and decided to be smart about this, and promptly got up and put away and out of sight a few precious breakable items that I usually have sitting around. The cats had parked themselves on the couch and had watched intently as I turned on the Kraken, but they hadn't run. I was impressed. Brave kitties. I went back and picked up Yoda 1 again and, holding him tightly, turned him on while I stood at the ready, prepared for anything. Switch on. Propeller blades once again spinning furiously with an ear-piercing whine, and yes, I opened my hand and lifted him gently off into the middle universe of the room. I've never dropped to the floor faster than I did as I ducked to avoid the manic, demonic, screaming creature as it whipped from one end of the room to the other, seeking its prey. It was like a shrieking hornet on steroids. I tried to reach up and grab it, but of course, it had sensors and knew I was trying to stop it. So it went the other way. Thank goodness it only made it across the room about 3 or 4 times before crashing madly into the living room wall and dropping to the floor with a defeated clatter. of once again loose propeller blades. I'd survived. Still cowering on the floor, I looked around the room, sort of getting my bearings, and that's when I realized the cats were gone. They were gone. No tails anywhere, no heads poking out from behind the couch. They'd left and they weren't coming back until. And that's when, after all those months of worrying and planning and avoiding and masking and distancing, I laughed. I was all by myself in my living room, COVID-free, hair probably a mess. Who cares? No Zoom meeting today. Still rather shaken by the excitement of a mad extraterrestrial being whirling and whizzing around my head a few minutes earlier. And it all was lifted away from me by the simple and profound disappearance of a couple of overweight, quirky cats who'd been way too lazy lately and needed a good run. I didn't see them again until mid-afternoon that day. They appeared cautiously from around a hall corner, looking around attentively as they slowly entered the kitchen, heading for their food bowls, of course. And yes, while they ate, they would intermittently raise up their heads and listen, before returning to the food at hand. I'm writing this piece on December 23rd. I don't know yet what the three Yodas have to deliver for our family on Christmas morning, but I can't wait to see a 12-year-old boy who's getting a little bit of a teen attitude, and a 5-year-old who thinks he's the sharpest knife in the drawer, and their mother who thinks she's managing us all very nicely. Meet their new friends, Yodas 1, 2, and 3. I hope the next year holds blessings, health, and safety for us all. The end.
And that's it for WordFest tonight. Our thanks to writers Mary Lyons, Dale Olson, and Alan Rose. Enjoy the new year. We'll see you in February.